A waiter at an exclusive restaurant dismissed a casually dressed black man, certain his assumptions would go unchallenged until the man's true identity turned the entire evening upside down. The sound of soft chatter and clinking glasses filled the elegant dining room of the Lexington Terrace, one of the most upscale restaurants in Santa Monica. The evening was alive with sophistication. Patrons dressed to the nines, expensive watches glinting under warm chandeliers, and the faint scent of freshly baked sourdough wafting through the air. It was a setting where appearances seemed to matter a lot. Through the polished glass doors walked Elliot Bryant, a 38-year-old tech entrepreneur who had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal earlier that day. Dressed in dark jeans, a plain navy polo, and sneakers that had seen better days, Elliot didn't look like the typical patron of the terrace. He had no intention of impressing anyone. Tonight was about savoring a quiet moment of triumph and treating himself to one of the finest steaks in town. Elliot glanced around, taking in the pristine white tablecloths and flickering candles. He was here for the food, not the spectacle. He adjusted his watch, a modest one, far from the luxury brands flaunted around him, and approached the hostess stand with an unassuming smile. The hostess, a young woman with neatly pinned hair, greeted him warmly and scanned the reservation list. Mr. Bryant, right this way." She grabbed a menu and guided him toward a cozy table by the window, one of the best spots in the house. As Elliot settled into his seat, the ambient hum of the restaurant felt strangely inviting. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, often being the only black man in a room full of suits. Tonight he just wanted to relax and enjoy the fruit of his labor. But then a shadow loomed over the table. "Good evening," said a man in a crisp white shirt and black bow tie, his tone sharp and disapproving. The waiter's name tag read Kyle. He was tall and lean with an air of condescension that made Elliot straighten slightly in his seat. "Can I get you started with water?" "Sure," Elliot replied, unfazed. "Still water, please." Kyle nodded curtly, but there was something about his expression, a flicker of disdain, a tightening around his mouth, that hinted at something unspoken. He walked away without another word, leaving a slight chill in his absence. Elliot brushed it off, focusing on the menu. The prices didn't intimidate him, but he still chuckled softly at the absurdity of paying $18 for a side of asparagus. Success had its perks, and tonight he planned to indulge. When Kyle returned with the water, his demeanor hadn't warmed. He placed the glass down harder than necessary, causing a slight splash. "Ready to order?" he asked, the words clipped. "Not yet. Can I have a few more minutes?" Kyle's lips curled into what could barely be called a smile. "Take your time," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. As he walked away, Elliot's eyes followed him. Something about the interaction felt off, but he wasn't here to cause a scene. He took a sip of water, his gaze drifting to the city lights outside. The night was still young, but beneath the polished surface of the evening, something was already brewing. Elliot tried to shake off the awkwardness from his initial interaction with Kyle. He reminded himself he wasn't here to dissect attitudes. He was here for a good meal. Yet as the minutes ticked by, that lingering feeling of being unwelcome began to take root. Kyle seemed to have no trouble attending to the other tables. Elliot watched him glide from guest to guest, his manner polished and professional. The smiles he offered to the couple at the next table were effortless, his tone warm and accommodating. But when he finally returned to Elliot's table, it was as if a different person had shown up entirely. "Have you decided yet?" Kyle asked, his pen poised over a small notepad. His voice carried the same edge as before, sharp, dismissive and clearly uninterested. "I'll take the rib-eye," Elliot said, keeping his tone calm. "Medium rare with the garlic mash on the side." Kyle jotted the order down quickly, barely glancing up anything else. "A glass of the house red, please." Elliot added. Kyle sighed lightly, just enough to be noticed, and walked away without a word. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping the room. A few tables over, a group of well-dressed men laughed loudly, drawing attention from the quieter patrons. Their waiter seemed unbothered by the disruption, laughing along and pouring wine with enthusiasm. The contrast wasn't lost on Elliot. When the bread basket finally arrived, Kyle placed it on the table with little care. The edge of the basket nearly knocking over Elliot's water glass. "Your bread," he said flatly before walking off again, without another word. Elliot sighed. This wasn't new. He dealt with moments like this all his life. The microaggressions, the subtle reminders that some people thought he didn't belong. But it was disappointing nonetheless. "Is everything all right, sir?" a voice asked. Elliot looked up to see the hostess, her kind expression breaking through his irritation. "Yes, everything's fine." He didn't want to make waves. Not tonight, but the discomfort was growing. And it wasn't just him who noticed. At the table next to his, an older woman with silver hair cast him a sympathetic glance, as if to say, "I see what's happening here." By the time Kyle returned with the steak, it felt as though every move he made was designed to test Elliot's patience. The plate was placed on the table with an audible thud, and the wine, when it finally arrived, was poured carelessly, spilling a few drops onto the pristine tablecloth. Elliot clenched his jaw but said nothing. "Thank you," he said evenly. Kyle's response, a tight nod, before he vanished into the crowd of servers. The steak, at least, was as perfect as advertised. Elliot cut into it, savoring the first bite. But the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. He noticed a few other diners sneaking glances at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Elliot replied, forcing a smile. One man, seated with his family across the room, muttered something under his breath that made his wife elbow him in the ribs. Elliot caught at a quiet exchange that ended with the man shaking his head and looking away. And that's when Elliot decided to stop ignoring it. Elliot wasn't one to let small slights get under his skin, but there was something about this night that felt different. As Kyle continued to avoid eye contact and brush past his table without a second glance, Elliot decided it was time to speak up. He raised his hand slightly as Kyle passed by again, plates balanced expertly on his arm. "Excuse me," Elliot said, his tone firm but calm. Kyle stopped, his expression unreadable. "Yes, there's wine on the tablecloth," Elliot said, gesturing toward the dark red stain near his plate. "Could I get a napkin or something to clean this up?" Kyle looked at the stain for a moment, then shrugged. "It's just a little spill. I'll send someone to take care of it." Elliot's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That someone wouldn't be you." "I'm busy," Kyle said curtly before walking away. A couple at the next table exchanged glances, clearly having overheard the exchange. Elliot caught their pitying looks, but he wasn't in the mood for anyone's sympathy. He placed his knife and fork down, staring out the window, trying to decide whether finishing the meal was even worth it. Minutes passed and no one came to clean the table. No one refilled his water. No one checked in on his meal. It was as though Elliot had become invisible. Elliot turned his attention to Kyle again, watching as he doted on other tables. with the kind of attentiveness that bordered on charm. When Kyle laughed at a joke one patron made, it was loud, enough to draw the attention of the entire room. Elliot exhaled slowly, counting to 5 in his head. This wasn't the first time he'd been treated differently because of how he looked, or what people assumed about him. But the night wasn't over yet. A manager appeared near the kitchen, clipboard in hand. Elliot thought about flagging him down, but hesitated. Something told him it wasn't time to escalate the situation just yet. Instead, he took out his phone and sent a quick text. "You wouldn't believe the service I'm getting at Lexington Terrace tonight." The response came almost instantly. "I'm 10 minutes away, don't leave." Elliot smirked slightly and set his phone down. He wasn't entirely sure if the message would change anything, but he had a hunch it might. Kyle returned just as Elliot finished the last bite of his steak. "Anything else?" he asked, his tone flat. "Yes," Elliot said, meeting Kyle's gaze directly. "For the first time that night, I'd like the check." Kyle nodded and left without another word. A few moments later, he returned with a small black leather folder and placed it on the table. When Elliot opened it, he couldn't help but notice the handwritten note scrawled at the bottom of the bill. "Dress code is business casual. Just FYI." Elliot's hand froze, his eyes scanning the words twice, then 3 times. It wasn't part of the printed receipt. This was something Kyle had gone out of his way to add. For a moment the room seemed to blur. Every polite smile, every hushed conversation at the surrounding tables felt distant. Elliot closed the folder slowly and looked up at Kyle, who stood nearby folding a napkin with an air of indifference. The words hovered on the tip of Elliot's tongue, but before he could speak, a familiar voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Elliot." All heads turned toward the entrance, where a tall man in a sharp, tailored suit strode in with a broad grin. And just like that, the tide began to shift. Elliot turned toward the voice, a subtle smile playing on his lips. Walking toward him was Nathan Caldwell, the owner of the Lexington Terrace, and a longtime friend. Nathan was a commanding presence, mid-40s, confident without being arrogant, and someone who had built his restaurant into one of the most exclusive spots in the city. Nathan approached the table with arms outstretched. "I had no idea you were coming tonight," he exclaimed, pulling Elliot into a quick embrace. "You should have called. I would have reserved the whole place for you." The warmth and familiarity in Nathan's tone drew the attention of the entire room. Kyle, who had been standing nearby, suddenly stiffened. His face went pale as he realized what was unfolding. Elliot chuckled. "Didn't want to bother you." Nathan figured I'd just come in, have a good meal and celebrate quietly. Nathan frowned slightly, glancing at the table. "Quietly, huh? What's with the stain on the tablecloth? And where's your wine refill, Kyle? Why isn't this table properly attended to?" Kyle froze, fumbling for words. "Yeah." I thought. Nathan's sharp gaze landed on him. "You thought what?" The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Nathan's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Elliot held up a hand, his tone measured. "It's all right, Nathan. Just a little hiccup in the service tonight." "Hiccup?" Nathan's eyes narrowed. "I don't tolerate hiccups in my restaurant. Especially not for someone like you." He turned back to Kyle. "Do you even know who this man is?" Kyle swallowed hard, his gaze darting between Nathan and Elliot. "He didn't introduce himself." Kyle mumbled weakly. Nathan's laugh was short and humorless. "Introduce himself? Let me introduce him for you. This is Elliot Bryant, the Elliot Bryant founder of Bryant Tech Solutions. You know the company that revolutionized the way businesses manage logistics. The man whose generosity has funded more community programs than I can count. The color drained from Kyle's face. The other diners began whispering among themselves, their eyes shifting toward Elliot with newfound recognition. Nathan wasn't finished. And let me add, this is not just a customer tonight. He's one of my closest friends. So tell me, Kyle, how exactly have you been treating him? Kyle's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But no words came out. Elliot, sensing the growing tension, leaned back in his chair and looked directly at Kyle. His voice was calm but carried undeniable weight. It's not about me being your friend's guest, Kyle. It's about the fact that you treated me differently the moment I walked in. The question is why. The room fell silent. Even the clinking of glasses seemed to pause. Nathan folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. Well, Kyle, I'm waiting for an explanation. Kyle stammered, his professionalism completely unraveled. I didn't mean it. Wasn't personal. I swear I just thought exactly. Elliot cut in, his tone sharper now. You thought you looked at me, saw what I was wearing and made assumptions. Isn't that right? Kyle's silence was answer enough. Nathan's face hardened. My restaurant doesn't stand for this. Not from anyone. Especially not from someone who represents it. Kyle, we'll talk privately after this. But for now you're dismissed for the evening. Go. Kyle hesitated. But the look on Nathan's face left no room for argument. With a bowed head and trembling hands, he walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Nathan turned back to Elliot, his expression apologetic. Elliot, I'm so sorry. This is unacceptable. And I'll make sure it never happens again. Elliot offered a small smile, though his voice remained firm. It's not just about me, Nathan. If it can happen to me, it can happen to someone else. You can't let people like that work here. Nathan nodded solemnly. You're right. And I promise I'll do better. The room, which had been silent throughout the exchange, now seemed to breathe again. Patrons began murmuring, their faces reflecting a mix of guilt, curiosity and admiration for Elliot's composure. But for Elliot, the night wasn't about vindication. It was about something much bigger. As Kyle disappeared into the back, Nathan signaled to another waiter, who hurried over to Elliot's table. The new server was the polar opposite of Kyle, attentive, polite and visibly eager to correct the evening's earlier missteps. Let's get you a fresh tablecloth and another glass of wine. On the house, Nathan said, placing a reassuring hand on Elliot's shoulder. Anything you need tonight, it's yours. Elliot waved it off with a slight shake of his head. Nathan, I appreciate it. But this isn't about a spilled glass of wine or a stain on the tablecloth. Nathan nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Elliot's words. Then let's make it right, not just for you, but for anyone who walks through that door. As the staff hurried to reset the table, the murmurs in the restaurant grew louder. Some patrons looked visibly uncomfortable, likely reflecting on their own biases. Others appeared embarrassed, their eyes darting away. When Elliot's gaze swept the room, I didn't come here to make a scene, Elliot said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. But maybe this scene needed to happen. Too many people walk into places like this and leave feeling like they don't belong, like they are being judged the moment they step through the door. Nathan's brow furrowed. You're right. And that's not the kind of place I want to run. It starts with holding people accountable. And I will. From across the room, The older woman who had noticed Kyle's behavior earlier stood and approached Elliot's table. Her silver hair glimmered under the chandeliers. As she smiled kindly, "Mr. Bryant," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I don't mean to intrude, but I just wanted to say how much I admire your grace. Tonight you handled yourself with dignity. In a situation that would have made most people explode." Elliot offered a small smile. "Thank you. I think dignity is all we have sometimes, and I won't let anyone take that from me." She nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. "Well, I just wanted to let you know. My husband and I will be following your work more closely now. Thank you for the lesson tonight." As she returned to her seat, others in the restaurant began to applaud softly. The sound grew, filling the space with an unexpected sense of camaraderie. Nathan turned to Elliot, his face a mix of pride and regret. "You've given me a lot to think about tonight. My friend, I owe you more than just an apology." Elliot raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not looking for favors, Nathan. I'm just asking you to do what's right. That starts with making sure this place is welcoming to everyone, whether they are wearing a suit or sneakers." Nathan nodded. "You have my word. And as for Kyle, he'll face the consequences of his actions. This restaurant's reputation isn't worth keeping. Someone who can't treat people with basic respect." The sincerity in Nathan's voice was enough for Elliot to believe him. But he also knew this wasn't just about one waiter or one night. It was about the bigger picture. The subtle, persistent biases that so many people face daily. Elliot stood, placing his napkin on the table. "Thank you, Nathan. Tonight wasn't perfect, but it was important." As he moved toward the exit, the entire room seemed to watch him, their earlier curiosity replaced by admiration. Some of them, perhaps, would leave tonight thinking differently about the world and their place in it. But for Elliot, it wasn't about being admired. It was about being seen. Elliot stepped outside into the cool night air, his mind still buzzing from the events inside. He paused on the sidewalk, gazing up at the glowing sign of the Lexington Terrace. For years, this place had been a symbol of luxury and exclusivity. Yet tonight it had become something more. A reminder of how even the most polished facades could hide cracks. Moments later, Nathan joined him outside, his expression earnest. "Elliot," he began, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, "I just want to say one last thing. You shouldn't have had to endure any of that. Not here, not anywhere. But you handled it in a way I'm not sure I could have." Elliot turned to him, his expression softening. "Nathan, it's not about handling it better or worse. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to handle it at all. That's what I want to see change." Nathan nodded slowly, the weight of Elliot's words settling over him. "I promise I'll do better for real this time." Elliot clasped Nathan on the shoulder. "Good, because this isn't just about your restaurant. It's about the kind of world we want to live in." As Nathan returned inside, Elliot pulled out his phone and tapped out a message. "Tonight wasn't the celebration I planned, but it was a reminder of why the fight for respect is still so important." The ping of a reply came almost instantly. "Proud of you, man. Let's celebrate properly tomorrow." Elliot smiled faintly, sliding the phone back into his pocket. He started walking down the quiet street, the sounds of the city a distant hum behind him. He knew the night had made an impact, not just on him but on everyone who had witnessed it. Back inside the restaurant, Nathan stood in the center of the dining room. Addressing his staff, his voice was calm but resolute. "What happened tonight will never happen again. Not here, not under my roof. We'll be better, and as for Kyle, his dismissal was swift and final. A clear message that prejudice had no place in an establishment that prided itself on excellence. For Elliot, the night wasn't about revenge or making an example of anyone. It was about something deeper. The quiet power of standing tall in the face of disrespect and proving that dignity couldn't be stripped away. No matter the setting, the lesson was clear. And it wasn't just for Kyle or Nathan. It was for everyone. Assumptions are dangerous, and respect should never hinge on appearances. As the city lights flickered around him, Elliot walked away with his head high, knowing he had turned a moment of injustice into a teaching moment, and for those who watched, it was a night they wouldn't soon forget. In a world where appearances often overshadow character, let's choose to lead with respect and kindness. It costs nothing to treat someone with dignity, but the impact can last a lifetime. If Elliot's story inspired you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge perceptions and spark change.